One night I was out with a group of friends and we had all different types of people of different ethnicities and religions. We left my friend's dorm and we were promptly stopped by a police officer who asked three of us to produce student identification. And the officer said, "Thank you very much," and he let us keep going. We came to realize that he had only asked the black men in the group to produce their identification. Had he asked some of the white people that were with us, they were not students, so they technically weren't supposed to be on campus, but that was no matter because of the color of their skin. Later that evening, I saw the officer letting a friend of mine go into a freshman dorm with a case of beer, someone who was under 21. And so I went up to the officer and I confronted him, and I asked him, I said, "Hey, why did you stop my friends and I earlier?" And he said, "Well, because you fit the description." "Really? What is that description?" And he said, "You're an African American wearing red." I looked at him and I looked down at what I was wearing, and I was wearing black. There was only one description there that I fit, and that was that I was an African American. And these are the types of things that happen to black people, to brown people around the country.
This past summer, I was working in Washington, D.C. I was with this world-renowned human rights organization, all of these great things that I can boast on a resume. But I was leaving from one of the subways one night.
Some friends and I were attending a party and we had stopped to park the car.
I was at a friend's house, walking home that night.
I, along with my roommates, were walking out.
I was being followed by the police.
The police drove by and we hadn't left the car as quickly as they thought we should have, so they came by and they asked us to get out the car.
I heard a car stop behind me. It was the St. Paul police.
We're walking outside the apartment, and out of the blues, they pulled up a gun and pointed at us, hide behind the car, and called the cops.
I asked him, "What's up?" "Oh, do you stay around here?" "Yes, I do. I stay right there at the house on the corner."
And they searched us for no other reason other than I guess we looked suspicious.
We got some reports that there was a Latino male breaking into cars and houses in the neighborhood. You kind of sort of fit that description, so we're gonna have to hold on to you for a minute. And I was terrified.
The cops came a few minutes later, and the first question that they asked us, like, "Where are you guys carrying a gun?" And then even though we called the cops to defend us, like everything was reversed. It's like we're becoming the aggressors.
So I'm walking back and the car is still following me. It goes to the end of the street, turns around, continues to loop back around. Because he assumed that I was actually a prostitute who frequented the area.
It was embarrassing, it was scary. My parents have done their best to make sure I have not been in situations like that, but that really opened my eyes to see just how frightening my blackness and my being a black man can be.
And out of the blues, instead of being the victims, we were like framed as the aggressors.
I go and I'm looking at the officers' faces, and they were laughing. They were laughing because they knew that they could get away with locking an 18-year-old in the back of a car because he fits the description.
No matter what I do, no matter how smart I purport myself to be, I will still always be looked at as the worst, the least of, the utter scum of society.
I think as a black person in America, we are subjected to so much scrutiny in terms of our behavior and people's expectations. I don't think people understand how vastly different black people are.
I think it's important to recognize that black voices and experiences are diverse. However, there is a common thread that exists within the community, and that's knowing that the system could fail you or your loved ones at any moment.
To be black in America is just extremely exhausting. There's not a day that goes by where I make sure that I say the right things to people, that I make sure I make the right decisions.
You know, when I think about being black in America, it's about a feeling that you have every day. That as a black man, I walk around, and whether it's here in Michigan, whether it's professionally, whether it's, in school, you walk around and realize how many of you there aren't.
What it does to the psyche and the complex when you're one of 6, one of 4, in the 7% of diversity at an institution creates a lot of insecurity and requires you to carry a lot of baggage in every situation and classroom you enter. Insecurity comes with the fear of fulfilling a stereotype, fear of being the dumb black kid, angry black woman, the unqualified affirmative action kid. That's a lot to carry in every situation going. And that's why diversity is so important.
There's this time where I was in a class and there was this professor, and every single time, noticeably, when I said something, his face would just shut down and he would ignore me. And so after a while, I decided to go and tell him. I was like, these things happened and I feel like they were dismissive and I just wanted to come to you and address them. And without saying, how can we work together? Without saying, what's our level of engagement? What can we do? As a professor who's been teaching for 20 years, you say, it's my fault that you aren't competent enough. And it's not one of those things where everything has to be racial or sexualized, but it's one of these things where you could clearly see that if this loud, black, articulate woman threw you off after 20 years of teaching, there's something in you that says that you don't even need to adjust your way of thinking for me.
When I was an undergrad, I was in a class with a pretty renowned professor. He was discussing one of his books. Ultimately, he was arguing that we need to connect that bridge, specifically for students that have unrealistic goals of attending college. It would be best if we just had these vocational tracks for these particular students. I raised my hand in that class and I asked him, quite frankly, what students are you talking about? Because it seemed like he was talking about the black and brown students that I was working with that were economically disenfranchised, that faced so many barriers to college education. He answered the question and said, that's exactly who I'm talking about. If we had a vocational track for these students, they would be so much better off. And they would have so much more than what they have now. I left that class literally in tears. I began to think about all the students that I had and all the students that I saw and how much vision they had for themselves and how much of themselves that needed to be in places that perhaps people hadn't seen them before, places that needed their humor, places that needed their experiences, their knowledge. While the evidence, economic evidence, would probably agree with what this professor was saying, was so bothered that the value that he placed on their lives was only to garner on a certain track. As I knew that my boys were visionaries, I knew they had so many more dreams for themselves, and I knew that their thoughts mattered. I knew that their lives mattered. I think from that point in that day in that class, I decided that education and educational policy was exactly where I wanted to be, because I wanted to be at the table to definitely advocate in any way I could for these students of color.
At home, when I was a little girl, I was taught that Blackness is a beautiful thing, that its history is raw and its history has a lot of pain in it. Part of acknowledging that pain is also learning to understand who you are, and I was also learning to see how beautiful and how celebrated being Black is and how strong being Black really is. But it was interesting because then when I went into school, I got this new view on that, to learn about the Underground Railroad. The way that my school did it was they created a Underground Railroad game, or a slave game, where we'd have people who were slaves and people who were masters, and that's how we were supposed to learn about it. Not only did it trivialize every single person's experience and history that is, put it in a context where it said, your life doesn't really matter. It is just kind of a game. I got really angry about that as I was growing up. I guess I just want to show that trajectory, just to show what it feels like. Learn that you're supposed to be celebrated, and at the same time society tells you a different story, and how hurtful that can really be.
I admit it, I had to grow into pride. Pride being Black, pride being a Black woman outside my household. I've never been ashamed to be Black. I grew up thinking no one else is supportive of my Blackness.
you're constantly in charge of your own reinforcement that you matter.
To say Black Lives Matter is bringing new attention to the fact that we need a new definition of what inclusion looks like in American society.
No one's arguing that every person on the planet doesn't have a right to life, but what we're saying is that in this moment, it's so very important to recognize these narratives and not have them brushed aside.
I think the hashtag means something very familiar in the Black community, a way to sort of value and appreciate the lived Black experience.
Black people within the United States, I think, face a daily experience that tells them, the world that conveys to them that their lives do not matter as much as other people.
There's no reason for a group of people to feel for their lives as they go about their everyday activities simply because of the color of their skin.
There's kind of been an allowance for us to be mistreated, whether it was by each other, whether it was by a different race, whether it was by the government. It's been okay.
Obviously, all lives matter, but unfortunately, we live in a society where Black lives are treated differently by our system in so many different ways. So whether you're talking about the criminal and justice system, the educational system, the list goes on.
During the transatlantic slave trade, Black people were treated as chattel, right? We were treated as cargo. The idea of slavery and trafficking people thousands of miles from their homeland is off this idea that their lives do not matter.
In our history, the Black body has been viewed as a commodity, as less than human, as something foreign.
We have a constitution that deliberately did not include Black people, and we still have, for instance, a Civil Rights Act that needs to be renewed just so we can vote.
Living in communities, as many Black people do in the US, where it's over-policed, and their bodies are criminalized.
A lot of that psychological reasoning behind the way people used to think still resonates within us all today.
When I turn on TV, when I look at the media coverage, when I see some of the things that are going on in some of these different communities, it's difficult for me to honestly say that Black Lives Matter. It seems to be something we need to fix.
And by continuing to say that we live in a post-racial society, you're denying our very existence, you're denying our very circumstances. And so we have to call attention to the fact that Black Lives Matter because it allows us to sit and talk about all the things that we're trying to shove under the rug.
It's the way for Black people, for one, to show America that we are here, we're here to stay, and we're not going anywhere.
It's our job to value human life, and I think the call of Black Lives Matter, it forces us to remember that.
Yes, we're very conscious that all lives matter. I think if you were to ask anybody today, consciously we would say, well, all lives matter. You shouldn't take the life of anyone.
And before we can get to a point where we can say truly that all lives matter, we need to start acting like Black Lives Matter first.
That's a tough question to answer because I truly believe that the system itself must be deconstructed and rebuilt.
And I think another thing that would go a long way to show that Black Lives Matter is admitting that we are biased, we are prejudiced, we are racist. We are still dealing with these things in society. Because of that, people are going to look at me a certain way. People are going to judge me a certain way. That's okay, but just tell me you're going to do it. Say, hey, you know what? You are Black. You know what? This is how I was raised. This is what my bias is because of my experiences. Oh, well, okay, I'll accept that.
People don't just start with some of the things that we see play out on a day-to-day basis in the media, that we see play out in our communities. These things are learned.
And it comes from breaking down those institutions that have protected so many people for so long. And we have to change it, and we have to be vulnerable, and we have to be willing to exercise our right, and really a willingness to be uncomfortable because my fellow human being is worth my discomfort.
Come in places with an open heart, listen to people's stories of discrimination or their experience with racism, and just understand their stories and try to, catch yourself when you do, have your own stereotypes against a specific group of people.
That's a social duty on all of us, including myself. That's a collaboration between societies, civic societies, government, media. Everybody has to chip into that to change the whole perception that Black lives do matter.
Even just this morning, I wake up and I find in the news is telling the story of a man who was lynched a few miles from my hometown. But of course, it is not the lynching that mattered. It's not the fact that this man was murdered. It was the fact that he committed a crime 35 years ago. And you would think in a system that is built upon this idea of the underdog mentality in which you are able to redeem yourself, that you will be able to like rise up and surpass, your past. So I think if anything, one of the first steps that we have to get through is how the media portrays us.
I think probably the first thing that we need to do is we need to change the way that communities of color are policed in this country. Right now, there's a lot of implicit and explicit bias. There's systemic racism at play here. We need to explore ways that the community can interact with police in a manner that's safer for everyone involved.
I think that people need to want to be more aware of what a group of people in this country are going through, how a group of people historically in this country have been neglected, have been oppressed, have been violated, and more importantly, for people to see the role they play in that. Whether it's owning privilege, whether it's kind of accepting the status quo, whether it's consuming these things that contribute to stereotyping. It's about walking in a room and realizing like, hey, there's no Black people. Walking around if you're white and realizing all the things you don't have to think about. Going to class and realizing like, hey, we're only starting and finishing with, white scholars using white knowledge. The change I want to see is that, I can walk around and the things that I think about, the things that I'm forced to grapple with don't have to just be, kept quiet.
I would like to see policymakers implement policies that really have an objective to move Black lives forward economically, socially, as well as emotionally and mentally. And I know that sounds really big, and many people would question, can policy do that? I think it can be done. We just have to dedicate ourselves to do it.
I would definitely want an executive order by the president, whoever, right, represents this country, has yet in history to recognize the trauma, crimes against humanity of the slave trade. Multiple nations of elected officials have given that apology. What's America afraid of? In order for healing to begin, we need the highest power to recognize it as true, verbally and on print. And from there, I feel like in time, that reality, that elephant that's going to be slayed through that acknowledgement and recognizing of historical violence and murder, once that's recognized, I feel like people will begin to get serious about the issues of race relations in America.
On the policy level, I think it's important that we enforce inclusive policy making and create programs that meet the needs of the recipients.
I wish that the university did a better job of having a continuous relationship with Black students on campus and making sure that, I think it's very important to get students to come to the university. It's a very great university, but at the same time, once they get here, it's really important to build a relationship with them, really learning about what their challenges might be, and so that they can provide support necessary so that these students can be successful graduates of this university.
We need to start giving people the tools to be able to think differently. And I think that starts with, in the schools, at the elementary level, giving kids the truth about American history, then working your way up through colleges and even master's programs where you have, when you're giving case studies or you're giving different lesson plans, that you are equitably representing different perspectives and different communities and making people critically think through those texts.
It's not just about numbers and bodies of diversity in a room. It's how do you thoughtfully and purposefully engage those different lived experiences in a way that's meaningful for people. And that doesn't just start and stop in schools. It has to continue through workforces. It has to continue in communities. If we want to get to a place of common and human understanding, the only way to shape that is through communicating those different lived experiences in the places that we all meet and interact.